Well, welcome to True House Stories. I am Lenny Fontana coming out of New York City. It's springtime. And you know when you get phone calls and you know when people let you know that you're doing a pretty good job. Well, this man came knocking at my door, ding dong, and said, "Hey, you know about us down here? Down where men at work were working, making their songs." And I said, "Yeah, I know. I've traveled there in this little world called Oz, far away near another place called Tasmania and New Zealand." I said, "Yeah, I know that area." He says, "Well, I've done a lot. I've done a lot for this scene." I said, I know. And you're all over Track Source and people know who you are. And we're going to bring him up right now to introduce him to this show. He woke up as it's dark where he is to meet us on the Northern Hemisphere time. So without further ado, I want to bring up Ken at Work.
Good afternoon, good morning, good night.
Good evening. Good evening, good morning, and good afternoon. To the ones in Europe, it's now 7 o'clock, 7:02. Here in New York, we're 3:03 in the afternoon, and we welcome you, Ken. I know you had to get up super early to make our clock, but everyone came to see you. So welcome to the show, mate. How are you?
Thanks very much for having me, Lenny. Very good to be here.
Thank you, and I'm glad we're able to bring you to this audience. So I said enough. I'm going to leave it with one question because I know you got a lot to tell us and you've been raring to go. So how does music find a young Ken at Work?
How does music find a young Ken at work? Well, I suppose the earliest influence was my father was a musician in the British Army. He played the tuba, and the tuba is, very, very difficult, taxing instrument to play. And my dad was in the marching band, so all the timing that I learned came from playing from my dad, playing his marching band records at a young age. And then, so you had my father who was English and my mother who was Scottish. She loved the bagpipes. So I don't know if you've heard the bagpipes, but that's another difficult instrument to play. But anyway, so I had that influence of my mother playing the traditional Scottish records, my dad playing the marching band records. And then, of course, I had my two older sisters who were into the sort of 60s, late 60s psychedelica. And one of my sisters was actually into Stevie Wonder as well. So that's how I sort of first came across black music, I suppose. The earliest influence was Stevie Wonder, because you've got to set the scene, Lenny. Back then when I was a kid, there was no black music on radio whatsoever. No disco, no funk, no soul music. The only time that you would ever hear it on radio was if an artist had like a number one song in the States, then they'd play it on radio here. So it'd be like, the Commodores or, some Stevie songs, like Uptight, Everything's All Right. I remember, hearing that on radio when I was a kid. So it was a very, very rock-orientated country for a long time, for many, many years.
So you heard Stairway to Heaven, Led Zeppelin. You were hearing The Doors, you were hearing proper Chicago, all the big...
Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap.
Jethro Tull, Locomotive Breath. I know, I hear you.
Yeah, so back then in the early days, it was, the influences, musically, when I first started off, of course, was rock and roll. And then, through my sister hearing Stevie Wonder, and then in the sort of mid-70s, there was a show here in Australia called Night Moves, which was hosted by a guy called Lee Simon. And Lee Simon was the first to introduce a lot of artists which you just wouldn't hear on rock radio. This is like very early, Robert Palmer, when Robert Palmer was very soulful, Bob Marley, a lot of artists that you'd see he used to stream a lot of artists from a show called the Old Grey Whistle Test in the UK. And one of the earliest artists which influenced me was a guy who you may know, Garland Jeffries. Garland Jeffries was an old school sort of. He was a fusion between soul, rock, and reggae. And he had the song. Remember the song "Wild in the Streets"?
Yeah, but it wasn't big here in America. That was big over in the UK and your part.
Yeah.
It was never really big here.
So that's where I sort of got my early influences from. From glam rock. I mean, influences are what you're fed. And then, so then it just, the mainstream record stores were just sort of selling rock and roll music. So you had to actually dig deeper if you wanted anything that was a little bit left of centre. And disco, soul and funk was left of centre. So you had to travel into the heart of the city to find, good music and good records.
So how does it begin now for you? Because I'm getting the bagpipe.
Does sound a bit like a dead cat.
Yeah.
Swinging the cat's tail.
They do it here at all the police benefits. So I've heard many bagpipes. But I'm going to ask this because how many generations are you Australian now that you have coming from Europe?
It's probably, three or four generations. Of course, Australia was founded by the English back in.
We know that. Oh, we know that.
1776, I think it was. So, so the generations go back, for sure, like early settlement. I mean, of course, the original people, the Aboriginals, were here for hundreds of thousands of years, really. One of the oldest indigenous peoples.
It's the Native Americans. And when we all came in, we had our way and changed everything that they had for thousands of years already. It's crazy.
Yeah.
So you're back to your disco. You're back to disco, and rock is all over the radio. And because I know like the UK, as much as rock was prevalent, it was very close to the American shores as far as Top of the Pops bringing some of those big acts from America. Yeah. I don't know if they really made it to those shores, but more so the UK would be very like a sister to America in a sense, getting the music quickly from, let's say, what was happening in the United States. Within a few weeks or a few months, you would hear about it in Australia. In the United Kingdom. But was that the same in Australia at that time in the 70s? Or was it just you were catching whatever was big in America only?
Yeah, Australia was influenced by both the UK and the US. But mainly, you'd have to say rock and roll music, more so than the funk and disco acts. Of course, it all blew up, like with the Bee Gees, with Saturday Night Fever, and then everybody jumped on disco for a couple of years, and then as quick as disco was popular, they dropped it again. So it rose and it fell. But I suppose the good thing about that with the popularity was that there were a lot of new clubs that opened too in the late 70s, early 80s. So it certainly laid the foundation here for what was to come.
So where does it begin for you? The DJing, the whole, can it work? How's this begin for you? Starting, from the beginnings of the disco, because I know you go back to that era.
Yeah. Well, I began DJing in '78, and I actually became a DJ by accident, of all things. By the time I was sort of 15, 16, had a pretty good record collection, probably a couple of hundred records by then. So, I was sort of at school working part-time jobs, and, I'd always try to buy a couple of 7-inch singles a week, maybe an album or two. If you worked a bit of overtime, you buy an extra album. And so, by the time I was 15, 16, I had a pretty good collection. And then one day I get a knock on the door. A friend of mine, his father ran a high school disco here, and I get a knock on the door and said, "Ken, we need you to DJ." And I'm like, what's going on? And he's like, well, the guy that we had working in the venue, his father had an argument with the guy that was DJing, and the guy that they had DJing, he had his light boxes kicked in. So through the argument, he wanted him to pay for the light boxes. He said, "No, I'm not paying for your light boxes." So he just decided not to turn up. So they had 200 kids at this high school disco and no DJ. So I got a knock on the door, "We need you to come and DJ." So the first record I ever played was Boogie Wonderland, Earth, Wind and Fire. Dropped it on the turntable and then had no idea what I was doing, but the kids liked what I did. So then I just did that for maybe, for a couple of years. But through that, I met some good friends, and then went to my first club when I was 17 and had my first residency when I was 17 and 10 months. So it was a true baptism of fire, as they say.
I know. So let me ask you then, was there any go-tos around you at that time that was mixing or anything that you guys were talking about, or you heard about, or heard them play at a club and said, "What is that?" Where they're making the transitions, because again, you guys, you're not really, you're in your own little microcosm. So what was happening around you?
Well, one of the biggest influences in my career was a guy called Mick Williams, and Mick Williams was working at a club called Casablanca. And Mick was a South African guy who had been in Australia for 3 or 4 years. And when I saw Mick play, because coming from South Africa, of course, they had all they had access to all the music, and it was just the mixing was just mind blowing, like what it was doing, because that was one of the first clubs that had the original the techniques before the 1200s with the roll pitch. Remember the roll pitch? It had a little wheel, so you had to adjust the wheel. So,
I still have my 1100s, so I know.
Oh, do you?
Yeah, I'm
fantastic.
So the little pitch wheel.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
So, and when you tell people that they had the little pitch wheel, and what he was doing was just amazing. But the influence that man had on my career and my musical taste was absolutely second to none. Because, as you know, you're living in a country where there's virtually no black music on radio. There's, of course, this is, no internet, no mobile phone. So how are you going to find out about music? The only way was in the clubs. So you had to rely on those people that were a little bit older imparting their knowledge onto you. And the greatest thing with Mick is that he was willing to impart that knowledge. So he would be like, he'd put on Muscle Shoals Horns, he'd put on Red James Odyssey, What is Funk? So all these old school funk songs, Muscle Shoals sounds, and, you know, and Daz by Brick, you know, all these Chase Me by Confunction. So all these classic songs he's playing, and you're hearing these songs for the first time, and it's just, your mind's just spinning. Your mind's just spinning. But he was willing to impart that knowledge onto you, and he'd say, you know, this is the album, write it down, go and find it. So then I would, you know, do a hunt through all the stores in Melbourne, or I'd be ringing up stores in LA or in New York to try and get a hold of this record, because it, you know, and the telephone calls would end up costing you as much as the record that you're buying, you know, because you didn't have access to the music. And then, yeah, so then I had my first residency when I was, you know, on the cusp of turning 18, and then it just all took off from there.
And this is actually fresh new thing, total new thing, man. It's totally new. This is new.
Yeah.
New story. There is nobody to go, well, let me go look back what they did. There's nobody to go look back.
Yeah. And then within the community, that, you know, the DJ community, and then as I got to know, and, you know, we were talking about the great club Chasers, and, you know, Chasers is still going. You know, 45 years later, Chasers is still there. It's like that bastion of Melbourne clubbing that, you know, that just stood the test of time. And of course, there's been other great clubs. You know, you probably played at the Metro here in Melbourne. There's great nightclubs, but they're dust and rubble now. The Chasers is still there.
Chasers is still going strong. It's like in The Godfather. I gave him 6 shots, and he couldn't go down. Then I have the bad luck now. Wow. That's another thing I learned about old school Melbourne. It was all run by mafia Italian guys.
Yeah.
Kind of like New York in a way. The way when I went there, I was like, wow. Even here, ran it the same way.
You know, I don't know if you ever went to the fruit and vegetable market here in Victoria Market, which is just on the cusp of, on the outskirts of the city. And they had mafia shootings in the 60s there, you know, with all the fruit and vegetable guys, with all the standover men. So, yeah, it was. Back then, yeah, for sure. Yeah, so then, you know, getting back to the music. So, you know, there was a DJ at Chasers, John Patton, you know, who was a great influence, again, on my early career. He was an English guy who migrated to Australia, again, a great mixer. And these guys had access to good records, and they had good collections. But then the first international DJ who had a residency here was a guy, you may have heard of a guy called, you know, Mario Gonzalez. He was a DJ from LA in the late 70s, and he came and he had a residency at a club here called Madison's in Melbourne, and this is going back to 82, 83, and he had all the US record company promos, all those promo 12s, and all the acetates and test pressings, and that was just wow. You know, it's like we just didn't get access to any of those records at all until probably, you know, the 90s. The record companies started servicing vinyl to DJs here, where you get the promo packs. But before then, it was just unheard of to see tracks and hear tracks on 12s that you didn't even think existed. Well, you didn't know that they existed, but they do.
No, I know that. There was a lot of things going. You know, I tell people those test pressings and those promos were gold for DJs back then, because not everybody had access to that stuff. Not everybody.
and they're worth an absolute fortune now. But the quality in those pressings is, when you hear them now, and as that the art of mastering for vinyl is completely different, and you've got to have the right mastering guy, the right cutting guy, just to get that sound that you want.
But you can explain that to the youngerns that watch the show. Those records were made with musicians and studios, and everybody had their jobs. It was not like now where it's the bedroom DJ does everything. You know?
And it's crazy, isn't it? As you know, a lot of the funk and disco, because it was all live music, live musicians, live drummers. As good as they were with their timing, it's just that's where you learned the art of beat mixing. Because you just had to be constantly on the go and tweaking it.
So off screen, everybody was telling me about his escapades working in the industry. This is where it gets fun now. So he's doing the DJ, and he's still young, and he progresses, takes it to the next level. So you could start telling us about the touring, the road shows, and stuff that you did.
Yeah, I was. It's sort of funny that you fast forward to the late 90s, and I had this idea because there was still a lot of the music, a lot of the club music that people were into. It wasn't played on radio, so I started work for a record label called Pro DJ, and I said to the owner, I said, every time I go into my barber shop, he's playing these old school tapes of Dancer, Gino Soccio, Harmony, Susie Lane, all the early disco stuff, like Laid Back, Ride the White Horse. And he said, man, if we could only get this music on CD, and a lot of it still hadn't been released on CD. So I said to Jeff, why don't we look at putting out like a mix? We have an album, we'll have a CD with 12 or 14 tracks. We have all the extended mixes, and we couldn't get access to the masters from overseas. So what we did is we licensed these tracks from the labels here in Australia, and we used the 12 inches, and we actually went into the studio and cleaned them up, got rid of all the pops and crackles out of them. And then we said, well, how are we going to get these to the people? And we said, well, what we'll do, there was a big chain of stores called Sanity stores here in Australia. And I said, if we can get them to play it on a Friday night or a Saturday afternoon when all the mums and dads are out shopping, and they walk into the record store and they hear this CD playing, and if they're there for 3 or 4 or 5 minutes and they catch 3 or 4 or 5 songs off of this CD that's playing, and these CDs just walked out the door. And we're talking about sales of, in Australian terms, maybe not big in American terms, but 15, 20, 25, 30,000 copies of these CDs we sold. So that sort of laid the foundation for my work within record companies. And then, and through that and through the club work, just through connections, just sort of started touring and building on my name and my reputation. And you may remember the label Vicious, which is John Corse and Andy Van with Madison Avenue.
Yeah, very well. I know the guys. But wait, before I even get to that point, before you mention Vicious, on those original compilations albums, did you compile them, or did they have you as a compiler, or did you actually mix them at the original ones?
Yeah, we mixed them. We went into studios and we did like it's like a mega mix, which is like 15 or 20 songs condensed condensed into a mix that was maybe, 15 minutes, similar to what DMC do in the UK, like with their mega mixes. So it's just a mix to sort of get people's attention, where you'd hear like maybe a minute and a half, 2 minutes of a song. So so we did that, and then in 99, 2000, started work with Andy and John at Vicious, and then we released a series of CDs called Dance R&B Anthems, and that's sort of like when the whole sort of like urban and funk thing was, there was this real groundswell of the music. So then I released my first CD through them, Dance R&B Anthems. I said to John and Andy, the music's gaining more and more popularity. Let's, why don't we test the waters and get a CD out there? And next thing you know, the CD's gone platinum. And platinum in Australia is like 70,000 units. So then from there, I got approached by Austereo, which is the largest commercial network in the country. And they asked me to put together a radio show. So next thing you know, I had a national radio show, a 1 hour radio show, which went all around the country. And then from there, just started getting approached by touring agents to work with different acts. So I was fortunate enough to work with Pink, Chaka Khan on several occasions, toured with Chaka, toured with George Benson, Earth, Wind and Fire, Kool and the Gang. Just marvellous experiences. Just to work with artists of that calibre was just, and to be a part of it.
Yeah, because they're all veterans in class act, each one that you mentioned.
Absolutely. And they're true artists that put on a real show. They give their all, whether they're performing to 200 or to 100,000 people. They put on the same show.
So now, when I asked you about the touring, I remember you mentioned about, we're going to give you a little anecdote there, Revice, so you can laugh a little bit. He did some work behind the scenes pre to this, when he worked with some of the rock bands and stuff. So we want to give you some light part to this. So off camera, he was telling about his story with AC/DC. All you know who AC/DC is, right? When he's screaming, ah! You know the singer, right? Every song sounds like that. He sounds like, even when he talks, okay. So you worked doing the backstage for a lot of those acts, right? Pre to this is...
Yeah, I worked when I was 15, during the summers, I started working for a company called Artist Concert Tours. And Artist Concert Tours did all of they worked in conjunction with the big promoters, sort of Michael Chugg and Michael Edgley and Michael Gudinski started putting on shows back then. Yeah, so I started working for Artist Concert Tours, basically as a rigger, setting up the speakers, setting up the stands, getting all the sound set up. And I was fortunate enough to, be up close and personal with a lot of those big name rock acts, and one of them was AC/DC. And yeah, I told you the story earlier how during the show, Angus Young, the crazy guitarist, had lost a plate he had a plate that had 3 teeth on it. So and you know how crazy Angus is. He's always sort of flopping his head. So his plate fell out. And back then, at all those concerts, the kids would throw streamers and God knows.
They'd be looking like they'd be just jumping up and down like yo-yos, right?
So then the concert finishes, and the band manager's like, we've got to find Angus's teeth. We've got to find Angus's teeth. And I said, well, I'll have a look. So I'm going through all the streamers on the floor, and finally I found the plate with Angus's teeth on it. So I go. So the backstage area was downstairs at this venue, the My Music Bowl. So I go downstairs,
Boom, boom, boom.
on the dressing room door, and the bouncer opens the door of security, and he's like, "What do you want, kid?"
What do you want?
And I said, "I found Angus's teeth." And then Angus comes in and he goes, "Yeah, thanks, mate. Thanks very much." And then they invited me. I was too scared. I was just like, open the door, and there's all these women. And
I was going to ask you, was everybody naked?
To be honest with you, I can't really remember. It was just all a blur. And my heart was just racing a million miles an hour. And I just handed over the teeth and ran.
Here's your teeth.
Yeah, and I got to work with Alice Cooper. We were talking about Alice Cooper.
Please search for part 2 of this podcast on the platform you're watching or listening to. And please do not forget to follow us